I'm going to go ahead and welcome our presenter, Christina Wang. She's a fish biologist with the Columbia River Fish and Wildlife Conservation Office for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she's stationed in Vancouver, Washington. Today she's going to present on the NPLCC-funded project that assessed climate change vulnerability for Pacific lamprey. She's been working on native lamprey species and specifically Pacific lamprey and the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative since 2007. This initiative is a multi-state partner-driven effort to achieve long-term persistence of Pacific lamprey and also support traditional tribal cultural use of Pacific lamprey throughout their historic range in the U.S. So we're really excited to have Christina and her expertise on Pacific lamprey here with us today. And I'm going to go ahead and pass the ball over to Christina so she can start her presentation.
All right, thank you again, Megan. And thank you everybody for dialing in today and registering for this webinar. As Megan said, I am going to be speaking about a climate change vulnerability assessment of Pacific lamprey. And this is something we've been working on since 2012, actually. And so I'll go through the assessment and then, most importantly, how we plan to apply their findings of this assessment in our restoration work for Pacific lamprey and the Conservation Initiative. So before I get started, I am the spokesperson today. This is certainly not my sole work. There's a group of people that have been working on this. Myself, Howard Schaller, who was Fish and Wildlife Service for a long time, who recently retired last September. Kelly Coates from the Cow Creek Band of Umpquas, Mike Hayes from USGS, and Bob Rose from the Yakima Nation. Also, a special thanks to Damon Goodman from Fish and Wildlife Service, who gave a lot of information and review regarding California lamprey. David Hines and Bill Brignon from my office helped with some data crunching, as well as getting information from the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group. So, and of course, funding from the North Pacific LCC. So thank you very much for that. This has been a very interesting and fulfilling project. So a little bit on Pacific lamprey. I know some of you work with lamprey. Others of you, this is a new species. So we like to start out with a life cycle. And this is also very important for why how we ran the assessment like we did, is based on their life cycle and based on certain life history characteristics. So adults, starting on the right here, adults spawn in fresh water and they die afterwards. They lay quite a few eggs. Females are quite fecund, 100,000 to 300,000 eggs in a nest. The nests look a little bit like steelhead reds. Those eggs hatch into larvae called ammocetes, and those ammocetes drift downstream to a slow velocity, silty, sandy area where they burrow into the sediment for 3 to 7 years. And at that time, they're filter feeding. You can see in this picture the tail here of an ammoset. They grow from about 1 centimeter into anywhere from 5 to 7 inches over those 3 to 7 years, where they're filter feeding and they're progressively moving downstream, at which time they transform, the larvae transform into juveniles called macrophthalmia, and then they migrate to the ocean. And you can see the ammoset stage kind of looks like an earthworm. There's no eyes. And then when they transform, they grow eyes, they grow their teeth, and they have this shiny appearance, like an ocean-going fish. So they migrate to the ocean where they're parasitic as adults. They develop teeth. They have this sucking disc where they actually suck to the side of fish and mammals and whatever sort of host they can attach onto, where they're parasitic for 1 to 3 years in the ocean. This is what an adult lamprey looks like, about 3 feet long. There's some variation in that. And then, so after the ocean phase where they're parasitic, they return to freshwater, but not necessarily to where they were hatched, which is a important distinction from salmonids, is that they go back to a freshwater area that likely is suitable. They know that it's suitable based on ammocetes that are rearing there. So they go back to a freshwater area where they hold over, actually, for about a year and maybe more. They hold over in that freshwater environment where they're not eating at all, and then they continue the cycle and they spawn and die. So that is kind of a unique life cycle for this anadromous fish. The range of Pacific lamprey from Japan around the Pacific Rim to Baja, California, Mexico. Ecologically, they're extremely important. They are food for just about everything, obviously providing nutrients in the stream after they die. They're a preferred food source for sea lions, the adults are. Fish and birds are often found with many either larvae or oftentimes the macrophthalmia stage, because those are the ones that are migrating. So you see these guts full of juvenile or larval lamprey. So ecologically, very, very important. And then, of course, culturally. Pacific lamprey are very important to Native American tribes, in particular the Columbia River tribes, coastal Oregon, California. There's some Washington tribes. There are a number of tribes that view lamprey to be as important as salmon. They use them for subsistence food, for medicinal purposes, for ceremonial purposes, and they've been doing this for generations. And it really is our partnership. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Conservation Initiative, but our partnership with the tribes in particular that has really driven the Conservation Initiative and studies like the Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment in order to really help with that goal of continuing with the ability for tribes to use Pacific lamprey. So this is a picture. This is titled Eels at Willamette Falls in 1913. Willamette Falls is still an area that tribes are able to harvest lamprey. And this is a picture where there was a lot of lamprey. It doesn't quite look like this now. And those declines are another reason why we entered into the Conservation Initiative with the tribes and with our state and other federal agency partners and local agencies. But so we see a lot of pictures of fairly abundant runs of Pacific lamprey, and due to the threats that have impacted Pacific lamprey, we don't see the abundance of lamprey runs quite like this. So in 2007, we being the Fish and Wildlife Service, again, along with the tribes and state and federal and local agencies, embarked on a Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative. And this is a multi-partner, collaborative effort, voluntary effort. There's no federal regulation they're not on the endangered species list. This is a collaborative effort with our partners to achieve long-term persistence of Pacific lamprey to support traditional tribal cultural use. You see there on the right-hand side are the regional management units that we use to study and conserve Pacific lamprey throughout the U.S. range. And the Conservation Initiative is broken up into three parts: the assessment, conservation agreement, and regional implementation plans. And when we did the assessment is when we first found out really that we did not know a lot about the potential climate change impacts on Pacific lamprey, and that would be something very important to consider. So this is we used NatureServe also for a risk assessment. This is a figure of the findings of the 2011 risk assessment. We're actually we're currently revising the assessment. We presented preliminary findings at our lamprey policy meeting just this past December, but we'll be finalizing the 2017-18 assessment this spring. But it's similar to this, and what you see here is that the red and orange areas are lamprey. This is based on HUC4, or watershed level analysis, and the red or orange HUCs are where there is more high risk. So high risk for interior Columbia and southern range areas. The coastal areas, which are kind of this green and yellow, which are a little bit lower risk relative to the interior and southern range. But an important part of the assessment, again, was that we found that climate change is potentially a key uncertainty for lamprey. And so we signed a conservation agreement in 2012 with our partners to collaboratively work on conserving Pacific lamprey. And as part of that conservation agreement, the next step was to write regional implementation plans. And those regional implementation plans is where we identify by regional management unit what the threats are, what the needed restoration actions are. And so identifying climate change as the key uncertainty, we thought in the regional implementation planning process, as we are prioritizing restoration actions, it would be important to use potential climate change impacts in the prioritization of those restoration actions. So obviously we needed some sort of systematic climate change vulnerability assessment. So as a pilot study in 2011, we used the NatureServe Climate Change Vulnerability Index and assessed Pacific lamprey with general air temperature and a moisture metric. Now, these are the metrics that are used typically for terrestrial species. But we wanted to get an idea to see if we could use the NatureServe Climate Change Vulnerability Index and to see what we would find. Because like I said, we were looking for some systematic way to assess the vulnerability of Pacific lamprey so that we could use that information in prioritizing restoration actions. So in 2000, in the special report on emission scenarios by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they produced these emission scenarios. So at the time, we used A1B, which is a more optimistic scenario, and A2, which is a more pessimistic scenario. And if you see, we ran the A1B. I'm just showing you kind of the bookends. Here we have the A1B more optimistic at mid-century, and then the A2 more pessimistic at end of century. So you could kind of see the best case scenario and the worst case scenario. Now this was done at a larger regional management unit scale for lamprey, and it's a little bit of a more coarse scale. But what you'll see in the pilot study, what we found is these green areas kind of presumed stable and yellow into moderately vulnerable. And then when you move into a more pessimistic emission scenario, you end up with more highly vulnerable and extremely vulnerable. So these were good results, but in speaking with the NatureServe people, we decided we wanted to do a climate change vulnerability assessment that had more current downscaled projections and climate scenarios, as well as with metrics that are specific to aquatic species. So instead of the air temperature and a more general moisture metric, we wanted to use something that would speak more directly to what the impacts to Pacific lamprey or aquatic species would be. So that's when we sought funding and embarked on this project with the North Pacific LCC. And so these are the changes that we made from the pilot study into the current study that we just completed. So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, gathers and reviews global climate models. So the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, which you've probably heard called CMIP-3, was released in 2010. That's the data set that we used for the pilot project. In 2013, CMIP-5 was released. They're constantly updating, and providing new projections. It's hard to keep up with all the new data that's coming out, which is fantastic. But so in the new study, we used the CMIP-5 data set. We initially looked at using 10 global climate models from CMIP-5. And I'll tell you as we got into this, an adjustment that we made to that. So as I mentioned, we used A1B and A2 emission scenarios. So in 2014, the IPCC released their 5th assessment report with greenhouse gas concentration trajectories. And these representative concentration pathways, this RCP 4.5 and 8.5, they describe possible climate futures depending on how much greenhouse gases are going to be emitted in years to come. And there's actually 4 of them, but we chose, again, to kind of bookend. We did a 4th RCP 4.5, which is more optimistic, and RCP 8.5, which is less optimistic. And so RCP 4.5 predicts an increase of 0.9 to 2 degrees Celsius by mid-century, and 1.1 to 2.6 degrees Celsius by 2100. And RCP 8.5 predicts an increase of 1.4 to 2.6 degrees Celsius by mid-century, and 2.6 to 4.8 degrees by 2100. So you see that 4.5 is a little bit more optimistic, RCP 8.5 a little bit more pessimistic. So those are the changes that we made. It's really just using more current information. Also, the changes that we made, like I said, we wanted to use something more specific than air temperature and this moisture metric. So we used, instead of the moisture metric, we went to hydrologic timing. Instead of air temperature, we went to stream temperature. So both of those would directly impact lamprey. And this next slide goes back to how exactly that works. So I showed you the life history, the life cycle of Pacific lamprey. And I mentioned all of these things that lamprey do. So there's migration timing, there's holding over for spawning, eggs being laid, hatching, amicetes rearing, and migration downstream, macrothelmia, transforming and migrating into the ocean. And so you see that a lot of these things, and as you can imagine, stream temperature is very important for a lot of these activities, as well as the timing of the hydrograph. So specifically, if you think of hydrograph timing, downstream movement of juvenile lamprey coincides with an increase in stream discharge. So earlier peak flows could potentially move juvenile lamprey prematurely to the estuary and to ocean before they're physiologically ready. Also, temperature. Increased stream temperatures potentially could increase respiration rates for adults, which could come at an energetic cost. Water temperature is a critical cue in the metamorphosis. It influences the onset of metamorphosis, the rate of development during metamorphosis, and the incidence of metamorphosis within a population. So, and there are various studies, a lot of studies with sea lamprey in particular, that specifically quote distinct temperatures at which these activities are impacted, and that's listed in the report. But there is quite a bit of literature that actually say that stream temperature and the timing of the hydrograph could have potential impacts to Pacific lamprey and their life history and their life cycle. So hydrologic timing. What we used for hydrologic timing was the hydrologic mean date, meaning the date when 50% of the volume of the river for the water year passes a downstream location. And what the information that's required for this are the estimates of daily historic flow, which is 1951 to 2006, and future projected flows for an area of interest. So that information, so we get from the CMIP-5 data set, so runoff and base flow data are downscaled to a local area. So these global climate models have large-scale information that then is downscaled to a local area of interest. Now that information was also run through a variable infiltration capacity, or VIC model, and that runoff and base flow data routed through via a stream network to produce estimates of daily flow. So now we have that information requirement in order to determine what hydrologic timing is. Stream temperature. We used August mean stream temperature. Historically, August stream temperature is the warmest monthly temps for the areas that we analyzed. This requires estimates of daily historic, again 1951 to 2006, and future August stream temperatures for an area of interest. So by getting the historic information and the future projections, we were able to use stream temperature. Now we don't have stream temperatures from 1951 to 2006. We don't have the amount of stream temperature data available in order to do this. So Dan Isaac from Norwest has developed a conversion from air temperature to stream temperature, and we used that relation to convert the CMIP-5 air temperature data set to stream temperature in order to calculate our climate change vulnerability index estimates. So into the index itself, there is 3 components that you must provide information for in order for the vulnerability index to spit out a score. So you have direct exposure, indirect exposure, and species-specific sensitivity. So first for direct exposure, again, we used August mean stream temperature and hydrologic mean date. And what you do for direct exposure is you're looking for, it's the comparison of the mean historic to future, mid, and end century data. So it's the change from historic exposure to future, both mid and end century exposure. So what you do is you create bins based on what those lamprey in those geographic areas have historically experienced. So you have a set of bins. From the historic information, from the historic data, you set up these bins, and then you actually assign the future projections into those bins. And what you find then is that at mid-century, this is an example that I have here. So for the Umpqua at mid-century, these bins, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the bottom, this is an insignificant change up to a very high change. So if you are assigning future projected years into these bins, what you would expect to see in mid-century is a larger number of future years into insignificant or more typically what they've experienced historically. And then as you go into end century, what you're expecting to see are more future years into high change bins. And so by looking at the distribution of where future projections fit into what has historically been experienced, you can tell what impact direct exposure is going to have on lamprey in those geographic areas. So again, you would see, as you go to end century, you would see a higher distribution of future years in these higher change bins. For indirect exposure, you answer the questions. What is the exposure to sea level rise in the geographic area? What is the distribution relative to natural barriers? What is the distribution of lamprey relative to anthropogenic barriers? What is the predicted impact of land use changes from human response to climate change? So by answering these 4 questions for lamprey in the geographic area that you're talking about, you designate a level of vulnerability from greatly increase to somewhat decrease. And so there, in the NatureServe guidelines, you would say, okay, what is the exposure to sea level rise? So if you're imagining a basin that's on the coast versus one that's in the interior, you would have a different level of vulnerability. So if you're at the coast, maybe it would be greatly increased because that is an area that might be directly impacted by sea level rise, versus an interior watershed where maybe it would be neutral or actually somewhat decrease the vulnerability because sea level rise is not really projected to impact that area. So you answer these questions and then you designate, again, this category and you put that into the model. Similarly, you answer questions about species-specific sensitivities. So questions about dispersal and movements. Are lamprey, do they disperse easily? Do they move a lot? Historical and physiological thermal niche. What was the thermal regime like? Historically, what was the hydrologic regime like? And this is where you get into the variation of, comparing what is coming in the future to what they have previously experienced in the past. What is the dependence on disturbance regime and climate change? What is their dependence on another species for habitat? Do they have a wide dietary versatility or a narrow dietary versatility? Do they have interspecific interactions? And then what is their measured genetic variation? So you're answering these questions and you designate a level of vulnerability, again, from greatly increase to somewhat decrease. And so you'll see some of these questions, especially the species sensitivity questions, especially going back to the issue that Pacific lamprey are not necessarily homing to their natal area and therefore have a more mixed population structure. You're answering these questions on a kind of a species level and not a geographic population level. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this. So especially the species sensitivity questions, are kind of answered on a global lamprey scale. So then what you get, what is entered into the model is direct exposure, indirect exposure, and sensitivities, which then spits out a numerical score which corresponds to a ranking, a categorical ranking. Presumed stable, PS, moderately vulnerable, MV, highly vulnerable, HV, and extremely vulnerable, EV. So keep these in mind when we look at the results, because this is where you'll see where each of these basins and for what time period and for what RCP emission scenario we're looking at. So just remember these abbreviations, and I'll point them out to you as well. So we've talked a lot about, what goes into the model. So this is what we actually simulated. We had 15 basins. So we got downscaled information, stream temperature, and hydrologic mean date for 15 basins. These are the basins in red that we did here. We tried to do a variety of places. We had to match information that was available. We didn't have as much information for Southern California as we'd like to at the time. So we had to match information that was available with areas that lamprey historically were and continue to be. We used 3 CMIP-5 global climate change models. I mentioned at the beginning that there were 10, and a lot of them were similar, and so what we did is we picked a more optimistic one, which is what we're calling NORESME. We have a middle-of-the-road one, which is BCC, and then we have a more pessimistic model called CISRO. We did 2 emission scenarios, as I mentioned before, RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5, and 2 time periods, mid-century, which is 2040 to 2069, and end of century, which is 2070 to 2099. So if you recall, when we talked about the direct exposure and the assignment of future projected years into historic bins, this is what I'm talking about. So for mid-century, you would have let's say August mean stream temperature for 2040, for 2041, for 2042, for 2043, and so on, and those would be assigned, and that's how you would find the distribution for mid-century and for end of century. So all of this went into a lot of simulations to find out what the impact was. And so these are some results. So these figures are numbered from our report. So that's if you were to reference these back to the report that we wrote, you'd be able to find them easily. So you'll see on this figure, there's the 15 basins on the bottom. Here is the score that I was telling you about: presumed stable, moderately vulnerable, highly vulnerable, and extremely vulnerable. These correspond to a numerical score. So anything under 4 is presumed stable. Between 4 and 7 is moderately vulnerable. Between 7 and 10 is highly vulnerable. And above 10 is extremely vulnerable. So like I said, the direct exposure, the indirect exposure, and those species-specific sensitivities all factor into a numerical score, which then comes out into a category score. So this figure shows NORESME model, which is the more optimistic model. And this, if you look at the blue, this is RCP 4.5 mid-century. The gold is RCP 4.5 end of century. The green is 8.5 mid-century, and the purple is 8.5 end of century. So you'll see, just for instance, in the Umpqua, at 4.5 mid-century, the category is highly vulnerable. Then at 4.5 end of century, the vulnerability index goes to extremely vulnerable. With 8.5 mid-century, also extremely vulnerable, and it stays an extremely vulnerable for 8.5 end of century. So you can see a variety of, it's different. Different basins have a different vulnerability. And some of them follow the pattern. Most of them, if you go from 4.5 mid to 8.5 end, you'll see an increase in vulnerability. So this is now using BCC, which is the other global climate model that's kind of the middle of the road model. So here you have, for the Umpqua in 4.5 mid, highly vulnerable, and then all three of these for 4.5 end, 8.5 mid, and 8.5 end are also in extremely vulnerable. So if you go back to Noresme, you'll see a slight difference, but the Umpqua overall is fairly vulnerable relative to the other basins. Then if you go to CISRO, which is the third global climate model, and this is the more pessimistic one, you'll see for the Umpqua in particular that starting in 4.5 mid-century and continuing through 8.5 end of century, that they're all in extremely vulnerable. So if you go back here, 4.5 mid was still in highly vulnerable, but using this more pessimistic model, you see that all 4.5 mid to 8.5 end for the Umpqua are all in extremely vulnerable. So I'm not going to go through each basin, but just wanted to point out an example and how you would read this information. But you can see as you go across where the basins fall out on the relative vulnerability scale. So similarly with this then, these are the three global climate models next to each other. So you have the basin on the bottom again, you have the category scores here, you have the same numerical score. Above 10 is extremely vulnerable, 7 to 10 is highly vulnerable, 4 to 7 is moderately vulnerable, and below 4 is presumed stable. So here you can see, I'll show you three examples. For the Umpqua, you have at the more optimistic model, it falls into highly vulnerable. This is at 4.5 mid-century, highly vulnerable here, and then you go to also highly vulnerable for the BCC, but then for the more pessimistic model, you see that for 4.5 mid-century, it's an extremely vulnerable. And then just for comparison, look at the Klickitat. So the Klickitat, regardless of which model you're talking about, all of them stay about the same, and they're all presumed stable. So for the Umpqua, it shows a little bit of difference between or among the different global climate models, but for the Klickitat, they show very similar results, and Klickitat looking like it's very stable compared to the Umpqua. And then if you look at the Sandy, you have 4.5 mid for Noresme is in presumed stable. You have for BCC, you have just knocking on the door of moderately vulnerable, and then for the CISRO model, you have 4.5, or I'm sorry, you have moderately vulnerable for the CISRO model. So just wanted to show you kind of some of the analyses that we did in comparing not only what was happening in within the model from 4.5 mid to 8.5 end, but also as a comparison when you compare the three different global climate models. So in conclusion of what we found with the findings of the vulnerability assessment and the categories that we found from each of these basins and the simulations that we ran, in all three of the global climate models, the Umpqua and the Yakima were the most vulnerable hucks. They were at extremely vulnerable risk category for the 8.5 emission scenario by the end of the century. So there are some reasons for this. The Umpqua had relatively low variation in its historic stream temperature and hydrologic timing. Remember when we talked about how direct exposure was evaluated, and that if an area had low variation, if it was not used to having variation historically, then any future change, it's going to have a harder time adapting to that. So the Umpqua, having had relatively low variation in historic stream temperature, so a very narrow stream temperature, and a very narrow hydrologic timing would mean that in the future, if those become less narrow and more erratic, then that's probably going to be more vulnerable. Also, anthropogenic barriers in the Yakima contributed to the higher score, higher vulnerability index for that area. In all three global climate models, the most stable HUC is the Klickitat, presumed stable for all global climate models, RCP emission scenarios, and time periods, both mid and end of century, which I showed you on that last figure. So the reason for this is the Klickitat had wide variation in historic stream temperature and relatively less impact from anthropogenic barriers. So, and also, little change predicted for hydrologic timing through the end of the century for both RCP 4.5 and 8.5. So again, if you look at those future projections, there's not as much of a change projected for hydrologic timing, meaning that that is going to be a relatively less vulnerable area. So what does this all mean? So you can certainly go to the report. You can hear what I said today. You can go to the report and you can find specifics, more specific information on how these models acted, what the projected vulnerability risk is going to be. So I mentioned that we really wanted to use this information in prioritizing restoration. So an example that I'm going to give you is in the Umpqua. That seemed to be one that was quite vulnerable. We looked at some of the reasons, that it had historically a narrow range of hydrologic timing and temperature. So as part of the conservation initiative, remember that we are developing regional implementation plans for each of the regional management units. And those plans, again, identify what the threats are. They identify what restoration needs exist in those areas. So this is the assessment. As I mentioned, we did one in 2011, which is the map that I showed you earlier. This is what the Umpqua looked like in 2011. There's been an increase in risk for that area in the assessment for 2017, going from imperiled, which is already not great, to critically imperiled. So we're factoring in the risk assessment information in conjunction with the climate change vulnerability assessment, again, to try and get at what we should prioritize for restoration. So the threats in the Umpqua, the major threats that were identified were dewatering and flow management, stream and floodplain degradation, and water quality. So we have the risk assessment, we have these identified threats, and now we have also some information on climate change vulnerability. So this is for, again, the three climate models. The blue is the NORESME, the more optimistic. The BCC is in the middle. CISRO is the more pessimistic climate model. This is for end of century and RCP 4.5. And you see that for the Umpqua, already at 4.5 end of century, that they're in the extremely vulnerable category for all, regardless of what climate model it is. So now that we have all of that information, we think that identifying actions that can increase flow, create backwater habitat, restore riparian vegetation, reduce stream disturbances from dredge mining, which is something that's prevalent in that area. So activities like this, if we were to prioritize restoration actions that would do these things, may have a higher likelihood of mitigating the increasing risk from climate change impacts. So the next steps for this are to apply CCVI, the Climate Change Vulnerability Index findings, to other regional management units to prioritize restoration actions. So these regional implementation plans are, they're updated every year. We're currently prioritizing projects in all the regional management units. We're hoping, as more funding sources come online for lamprey specifically, that we can use this climate change vulnerability information to prioritize those restoration actions and get those projects on the ground. We'd also like to expand the analysis of this to other basins as new downscaled information becomes available. As I mentioned, when we were doing this, we didn't have all the information for California. So California has 7 active regional management units. Actually, I should say the state is covered by 7 regional management units. And so going into California is a very important next step in incorporating, expanding this analysis to areas that we have additional downscaled information. So that's definitely something that we'd like to do in the future. And you may not, if you're from an area that wasn't on the map, we certainly have information for other areas, but we, like I said, chose those basins as kind of a broad range of where lamprey historically were and currently are. And so we certainly can expand this analysis into other areas, as time and all that becomes available. So in conclusion, again, just wanted to say thanks again to the North Pacific LCC for the funding for this project. My co-workers on this, we spent a lot of time together working on this study, and so thank you to everyone who contributed. And with that, I will be happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Christina. And just a reminder to everyone that's on the call, we're going to keep you muted for the question period. So if you have anything you want to ask Christina, just send me the question through NPLCC staff in the chat box, and then I will relay those questions to Christina for you. So we have a question now. How difficult is it to apply these findings to other RMUs, and will it require more funding to do so?
It isn't. You mean, so we already had, so for all of the basins that we did, we have, for all the 15 basins that we did, we have the findings, and we have that, we have regional implementation plans for all of those areas. So the current information that we have from the 15 basins that we did are ready to go. That information is ready to use right now in the regional management units. For expansion into areas outside of the areas that we've already done, would probably take a little bit more time and potentially a little bit more funding. But the information that we have now is ready, and it's actually quite a broad geographic area that could be plugged into a lot of different current regional management units. So we certainly have that information now. I just chose to highlight the Umpqua for you, but we have a lot of information that is and can and is being incorporated into regional management units. Additional time and funding would just be to expand into areas that we haven't done already.
Thank you. All right, next question. Why was the Klamath Basin included in the first few slides but not the final evaluation?
Yeah, so we didn't, and well, we had the Smith and the South Fork eel. And so it was, we didn't have information, we didn't have the appropriate information. I think that was just, it was on the initial figure that we had, and then we ended up not having the amount of information that we needed to do the analysis.
Okay, next question. Are there any lamprey, to your knowledge, in 3 Mile Creek in the Columbia River Gorge?
I think so. We have, I'm going to put in a plug for our distribution database that we have. If you recall the figure that I showed you of the U.S. range of Pacific lamprey that was from Japan until to Mexico, and it was kind of a crayon, literally a crayon drawing from Japan to Mexico. One of the goals of the Conservation Initiative was to create a very robust distribution database, which we have done in a lot of areas. We have a Pacific Lamprey Data Clearinghouse that you can find if you go to the Fish and Wildlife Service Region 1 Lamprey webpage. And on that page, you'll find a link to the Data Clearinghouse. And the Data Clearinghouse has a map-based tool, which you can see all the historic and current distribution for Pacific lamprey. and it's very specific. We have, it's at the stream reach level, but we also have observational data as well for distribution. So if you are curious, if anybody's curious about where Pacific lamprey are distributed and the information that we have currently on occupancy, please check that out. It's the Data Clearinghouse, and then there's, it's on the, like I said, the Fish and Wildlife Service Region 1 Lamprey webpage.
Great, and we can send that link out too in the follow-up that I'll send out. And we did have someone ask if we could send the PowerPoint presentation, and the answer is yes. We'll be sending the PowerPoint slides to you as well as a recording or a link to a recording of the webinar. Okay, and another question. So Jason from the Chehalis tribe wants to know if a dam in the upper main stem of the Chehalis River would cause a major impact on lamprey in the region.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
And we actually we're currently working on, just a point of interest for the Chehalis, we're working on an eDNA study, a joint study of eDNA and traditional electrofishing surveys in the Chehalis to kind of verify how eDNA works for lamprey. So look for that information. That's a joint project between our office and the Lacey office of the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as USGS. So there's some exciting information coming out of the Chehalis for distribution, and that the coastal Washington and Puget Sound area is an area that we really have had limited information on occupancy. So that's pretty exciting, but you should be able to see that as well on the Data Clearinghouse.
So Jason also just followed up, actually. I don't know if you guys are maybe partnering with someone from the Chehalis tribe, but he said, we've just taken eDNA samples from the upper watershed of the Chehalis River, and most of the positive hits we got for Pacific lamprey were in the main stem of the upper watershed. And he also asked, do lamprey mostly spawn in areas of the main stems, or do they spawn in smaller tributaries?
They mostly spawn in tributaries. There is some evidence of main stem spawning, but typically they spawn in tributaries.
Thanks. Okay, next question. What about shifts in dam management, for example, Lower Snake River Dam breaching, on climate change vulnerability of Pacific lamprey?
You mean what would that do to impact climate change?
Yeah, I believe that's what he's asking.
What?
I believe that's what he's asking. So breaching a dam, how would that affect the vulnerability?
Yeah, it would decrease it. So just like in the Yakima, where it was a higher vulnerability index based on anthropogenic barriers and distribution of lamprey relative to those barriers. It's quite specific, how you can answer those questions. And so definitely barrier removal, and again, that's why the interior areas for lamprey are so at risk, both with just regular, the risk assessment that we did and the climate change vulnerability, that it takes into consideration the lamprey distribution relative to those barriers. So certainly removal of barriers would decrease the vulnerability.
Thanks. Okay, so next question, I think I can answer half of it, and then I'll let the other half go to you, Christina. So Ben wants to know when a report might be available. So I know we have specifically for the project that the North Pacific LCC funded, which is mostly what Christina was talking about here today. We've got reports online for that now, and we'll also send the links to that. But Christina, is there any other related reports or anything that you might have coming up?
No, so you're right. So the one that is for this study in particular, you have. Okay. And then, but if anyone wanted to look at, say, the regional implementation plans as kind of companion pieces to this, and to see how we're, starting to use that information, those regional implementation plans can be found also on the Fish and Wildlife Service Region 1 Lamprey page, and it's pretty clear on the front. You'll see links for assessment, conservation agreement, and plans. And so any information that you'd want to find on those components of the conservation initiative that I talked about, including the regional implementation plans, you could find there.
Great, thanks. Next question, do salmonids prey on lamprey?
They do. they eat the small ones. A lot of different fish eat, I think ammonthetes must be super tasty. They're just like earthworms. There's varying sizes. They get flushed out. So yes, they're eaten all the time by a lot of different fish. But we always like to say too that when I mentioned adult lamprey are kind of a preferred food source for sea lions, we like to, we have an ongoing PR thing with lamprey, and we like to boost them up and put them in the best light as possible, that there is some sort of, predation buffer for salmon, and that sea lions are actually choosing to eat adult lamprey because they're so high in fat and oils, and again, must be really tasty. But yes, they do.
Thanks. Okay, so we currently have no further questions. If anyone is still thinking of their questions, we can stay on for just another couple minutes. But if nothing comes through in a few, we will end the webinar. And just as a reminder, we will send all of this to you guys, and any of the reports or links that Christina mentioned during the question period, we'll also send those to you. We did get another question. So in regards to large hydro system dams, do thermal stratification take in effect in the climate change model?
No, it doesn't.
All right. Currently no more questions. All right, well, seeing no further questions come in, we'll go ahead and end here. Oh, wait, hold on, we got one. Does biodiversity of lamprey seem to be a big factor?
In biodiversity of lamprey?
In warm water systems from cold water systems.
You mean?
Or glacier-fed versus rain-fed?
So the incidence of just lamprey in warm water versus cold water? I guess I don't understand the question.
Let's see. That is from Jason, so he might be typing.
Okay.
We did get another question, so we'll skip on to that one, I guess. Have you compared your results with the CRITFIC report on climate change effects on lamprey? If so, what conclusions can be made with this comparison? We have not, and that is something that we need to do. So CRITFIC came out, I think, and correct me, the person who wrote the question, correct me if I'm wrong, it was probably a couple years ago. And so it has been on our list to collaborate with them, and we work very closely with CRITFIC on the regional implementation planning process. So, and all of the identification of threats and restoration, this is all done at the partner level, and we use, CRITFIC is very active in this, the Columbia River tribes are very active, so the intention is to use their information as well as ours from this study to do prioritization, including all the other, information that we have. So we still need to do that as far as going forward with prioritization of restoration actions. Okay, and Jason clarified his question. So will lamprey in a rain-fed system handle climate change more readily than a glacier-fed system? It depends on, it just depends on how narrow the temperature is. So if a rain, fed system is a more narrow temperature, range of temperatures, then it's probably going to be, having a more narrow temperature range is going to make it more vulnerable. They're going to be more less likely to be able to handle that. If a glacier-fed, if that is, whichever is more narrow is going to be a more vulnerable situation because they're just less able to handle that. So you can look at what the historic temperature is, from like in the time period that we used, 1950 to 2006, and you can actually see what the historic range is. So anytime that there is a more
narrow range regardless of what type of system it is. That is when you're going to see a more vulnerable situation, a more vulnerable rank.
And Jason just noted that the Chehalis River is typically more known as a warm water system than other glacial fed systems in western Washington.
Okay, thank you.
We got another question, a couple actually. So how sensitive is the model output to assumptions about impediment impacts? What assumptions were made about the impacts of hydro dams on lamprey movements?
So that is a good question, actually. And hang on, I'm just going to, I'm just looking for this specific comment or the specific portion of our report. So the index represents exposure to climate change as a modifier of species sensitivity. So if the climate in an assessment area is not going to change much, none or few of the sensitivity factors will influence the index score, and the species is likely to score at the less vulnerable end of the range. Conversely, if a large change in temperature or moisture availability will amplify the effect of related sensitivities and will influence the index to score at the high end of vulnerability. So it is, you're right, that it is sensitive to what the temperature change is going to be. So if there is, so those species sensitivities are taken into, the weight of those or how it's calculated is taken into account how much those sensitivities factor into the overall score is based on how much exposure, how much temperature change there's going to be, or how much change in hydrologic timing there's going to be. So there definitely is a modification based on that with regards to how much the species sensitivities factor into the overall score, if that makes sense. And what was the second part of that question?
What assumptions were made about the impacts of hydro dams on lamprey movements? So
they, the way that the movement question was listed, it was, do they not move at all? Do they move a kilometer? Do they move 10 kilometers? And so we actually, based on which system we were talking about, you can factor in if it's a free-flowing system, they can go straight, without impediments from where they are to the ocean, or if they're having more difficulty doing that. So you can actually answer those questions, based on the specific area. And so that information can and was factored into the answers to those questions.
Thanks. So I'm going to take this one last question, and then we'll make sure to get everyone Christina's contact info in case you think of any other questions that you want to connect with her on. So last question. It seems that this study did a great job of incorporating stream conditions and geomorphology. Do you have any thoughts about how disease and physiology may be considered with warming of waters?
So, yes, there is disease information about lamprey, not necessarily with regards to warming temperatures. If you want, there are papers out actually quite recently about some disease challenge studies with lamprey, and really their, it seems, inability to contract and transmit certain viruses that are pretty popular in captive salmonid populations. So disease is kind of a new area of study for lamprey, and so it hasn't made the leap, or I'm not aware of specific disease correlation with warmer temperatures. The temperature information that I was talking about earlier, there's lots of literature about impacts of, of course, metamorphosis and development, egg development, larval development, that sort of thing, in sea lampreys, which is where we get a lot of our information for Pacific lamprey. So physiological information on various life stages of Pacific lamprey, including spawning, success in rearing, success in growing while rearing, onset of metamorphosis, the number of fish metamorphosing based on temperature. That information definitely exists, and it largely comes from the sea lamprey body of literature. But there are, there are more and more Pacific lamprey specific physiological studies on the influence of temperature on various life stages of Pacific lamprey. And just one quick thing, along with in the data clearinghouse, besides the geographic or besides the distribution database, we also are starting a literature database. And so there you will find a wide variety of folders and topics of lamprey with a lot of different literature and reports under those topics. You can also find that on the data clearinghouse.
Great. Thanks. Do you have time for one more question, Christina?
Sure.
All right. So this is the last one we'll take today. Does a lamprey leaving the Chehalis Basin always return to the Chehalis Basin? Wondering about natal streams.
No, they do not. So they do not go back to their natal stream. There are not distinct populations of lamprey. Some of them might return there, but they're definitely not homing to their natal origin. There's been quite a bit of population structure work done with initial findings showing that they really look like one large mixed population. But subsequent genetic studies have shown that there might be some broad-scale differentiation, but we just had a really interesting scenario in which a Pacific lamprey was tagged over by Japan and Russia, and it showed up in the Deschutes River.
Ooh.
So, and just like the whole study about tagging lamprey, I mean, all of this is very new, and we're looking forward to finding out a lot of information. But to answer your question, no, they definitely do not return to where they were hatched.
Great, thanks. All right, so we're going to go ahead and close. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. And thanks to Christina for a great presentation. And stay tuned for follow-up materials and links.
Thank you, everybody.
And you got a few thank yous in the chat, Christina.
Okay, thanks.
All right, bye, everyone.